Hi again, everybody. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com, and this is Ask the Lawyers. Today, we want to ask the lawyer about product liability and dangerous household items. And I'm not just talking about, minor inconveniences where something stops working. I'm talking about sometimes it can be much more serious than that. In fact, we had an example in Texas a couple of years ago where a seemingly normal household appliance that we've all used, an electric dryer, there was allegedly a manufacturer's defect which caused a fire and unfortunately had tragic outcome where 4 children died as a result of that. So here today to help us out is our expert. We've got Michael Callahan of the Callahan Law Firm in Houston. Michael, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate your time. In your experience, are you familiar with these types of serious problems that can happen due to product liability?
Well, first of all, let me address what product liability is.
Great.
The thing is that people, consumers, we have a right to expect that when we go out and purchase a product, that the product it's going to work. It's going to meet its intended use, and that it's going to be safe to use. In products liability law, it's an area of the law that addresses defective products and provides recourse to people when harm is caused, whether it's injuries or property damage. And so you've asked about the clothing dryer case. And, what's interesting is that washing machines and clothing dryers together, from 2010 to 2014, there were some 15,000 fires that were ignited because of something to do with the clothing dryer or a washing machine. And that resulted in, I think, some 8 to 10 deaths per year, hundreds of injuries, and hundreds of millions of dollars in property damage as well. So these things do happen, and the products have defects.
And I think sometimes, some products you go, okay, I understand that could be a dangerous product, say a kerosene heater or something like that. You realize that could have inherent dangers. But when it comes to a clothing dryer, I think people may not realize that could also be a dangerous product.
Well, that's true. And what's interesting is that when people go out and purchase products, sometimes products need to be maintained. In something like a clothing dryer, it turns out that something like 1/3 of all the clothing dryer's fires resulted because of poor maintenance or lack of maintenance by the user, by the consumer of the dryer. And what does that include? That includes doing things like cleaning the lint filter, the exhaust tubes. They need to be cleaned of lint as well. So that accounts for about 1/3 of the fires. And then the others can result from improper installation or faulty installation, or faulty mechanical or electrical components on either the clothing dryer or the washing machine.
So it sounds like you're saying it's a very small number then where it's actually the result of a manufacturing defect.
I'd say it's over 50%.
Oh, really?
I think the stats show there was about a 1/3 of the clothing dryer fires, at least, resulted from an accumulation of lint in the dryer.
And so that brings to mind the question: at what point is the consumer responsibility? If it's lack of maintenance, does that make all the responsibility on the consumer then? So there would not be any sort of a liability case there?
Rob, it's really a case-by-case basis. And the thing is, whenever someone buys a product, it's important to read the instructions and understand the instructions, and to understand the maintenance requirements as well. So there is a duty, there's a responsibility on the consumer, the user of the product, to use it in the way that it was intended, and to maintain the product as well. But unfortunately, even when users do those things, there are, on occasion, there are defects in the products that render the product unreasonably dangerous, and as a result cause harm to people and the property.
Is there sometimes too much of an expectation? The instruction booklet is too long, too hard to understand. Is there a point where you go, people can't be expected to do all of that involved?
That's a good question. And maybe what that does, that comes back to the product designer. Is can some of those complexities in maintaining the equipment, can they be designed out of the product? Is there a way to maybe to simplify the instructions manual, the warnings manual, maybe a recommendation that say for a clothes dryer that's the consumer should have someone come out first of all, have the clothing dryer in the washing machine installed by a professional, and also to have the system inspected every 1 year or 3 years or something like this. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Now, this time of year, obviously, we're thinking about, there's a lot of thought about toys and that sort of thing. Is that another area that can be dangerous?
Oh, absolutely. Household products in general. I mean, we think about products that children use. For instance, pajamas and clothing. There are regulations that address the material that can be used, because sometimes, and it used to happen more often than it does now, that the material in children's pajamas, it would be flammable. And clearly that's not a good thing. Unfortunately, that continues to be a problem, not as much as it once was. So you asked about this time of the year and with Christmas, and sure, with children, toys can be, they can be a whole lot of fun and entertaining for kids, and we get that. But we as parents need to be sensitive to the toys that we do buy. And some of the hazards associated with children's toys include choking hazards. If they're, say, beads or small parts, or the toys are small, and small kids tend to put them in their mouths and then swallow them, that can clearly result in a choking hazard. Also, sometimes larger toys that have pieces that or components that can be snapped off, and the next thing you know, the child has got it in his or her mouth. And another thing to think about is paint on some children's toys. There are manufacturers, many of them overseas, that don't really pay so much attention or adhere to the regulations in the United States, in that paint is not supposed to have lead in it. And especially paint that goes on children's toys should be lead-free, because lead is toxic, and when it's ingested, it can cause some significant adverse health effects. It can cause some bad stuff.
When we buy toys, in the package it says recommended for a certain age range. Is that enough for a parent to do to know whether or not the product is going to be safe for their child? Is that enough follow-up?
Well, we would hope so, but that's not always the case. And I think, some guidelines are, first of all, we need to pay attention to where we buy our items from, say our toys from. Is it a reputable store? And also consider, who the manufacturer is. Is it a reputable manufacturer? And also, where's the manufacturer located? Is it somewhere in the distance overseas? And, and again, unfortunately, sometimes foreign manufacturers don't pay attention to the rules and the regulations that we have in this country to protect consumers.
What does that affect then if there's a liability case? Is it obviously much harder to track down somebody who may be responsible if it's a foreign manufacturer far overseas? Maybe hard to track down who the original manufacturer is. Does that make your job harder?
It can, yes, because there are a lot of foreign manufacturers. But the thing is, in the area of products liability law, the potential defendants that we look at, they include the manufacturers, and that would be who designed the product, who actually manufactured the product, who created the warnings that are associated with the product when they're shipped out. So we look to the manufacturer, and sometimes, many times the manufacturers are here in the United States, but also as the years go by, it seems like more and more products are being manufactured overseas in different parts of Asia, in China. And so that certainly can present some hurdles in trying to get justice against those kind of manufacturers. But the thing is, in products liability law, we look to the manufacturer, but products liability law in the United States also addresses accountability for distributors of the product as well as sellers of the product. So when we look at a products liability case, we look at all of those entities as potential defendants in a case.
We've talked about appliances, we've talked about toys. We also hear stories about furniture items that can be especially an issue with children. Is that another area that is a big area?
Right, sure. You know, the great example, or an unfortunate example, I guess I should say, that I think we've all heard about is these certain furniture items, dressers, in cabinets that were sold by a well-known company called IKEA. The thing is, these cabinets were purchased and then brought home and put in kids' the bedrooms and installed as instructed and then set up. But the thing is, there's these cabinets and dressers had a tendency to tip. So when these cabinets and dressers are put in place, they're filled with clothing and whatever else, and then you've got a small child that's reaching up to get into a drawer, say reaching up to the top surface of the dresser and is pulling on it, as kids will do. Unfortunately, these dressers and cabinets were tipping over and tipping on top of children, and it's tragic. I think there have been some 8 to 10 deaths reported over the last say 7 or 8 years as a result of these tipping incidents. And then in 2016, I believe it was, IKEA actually issued a recall. It also added some additional warnings, and that included when these dressers and cabinets are installed, that they need to be bolted or secured or anchored somehow in the wall that they're up against, right, which makes a whole lot of sense.
Sure.
But if the instruction manuals and there are no warnings to that effect, one is typically not going to think, oh, well, I need to go bolt my child's dresser into the wall. So
right.
That's
whenever things like this happen, especially when there's tragic outcomes like that, we start talking about regulation. Is this industry regulated? Is it regulated enough? Who's doing the regulation? What's the answer there?
That's a really good question. I mean, some products are regulated, quite frankly, most are not. And that's, so who regulates certain products? Well, the U.S. government, we've got an agency called the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the CPSC, and they regulate and oversee consumer products, including children's toys. And I think typically they issue about 300 recalls a year. And so one wonders, well, how can I figure out if something's been recalled? Well, there's a very useful website that you can go to, and it's www.recall.gov to look to see what products have been recalled. So that's a good place to check. Also, to say there's the FDA as well, the Food and Drug Administration, that regulates drugs, medical devices, cosmetics, a lot of our food as well. And you can go to their website. People can go to their website and see what items have been recalled. And then going off on a little bit of a tangent here, one that I think is especially useful is NHTSA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. They have a website called safercar.gov, SAFERCAR.gov. And anybody can pull that up on the internet. And all you need is the VIN number, the vehicle identification number on your vehicle, and it's on the inside of the door, of the driver's door, and you type that in, and it will show you on this website all the recalls that are associated with your vehicle, and it can be an eye-opening experience, and I would recommend that everybody do that.
And auto safety and that sort of thing might be a separate show, but that brings to me another question.
Sure.
And I'm sure this is regulated at some point, but at what point is the responsibility on the manufacturer to make sure there's been enough notice put out about a recall? And at what point should a consumer go, well, I didn't hear that there was a recall for this safety issue on my car? Where does the responsibility lie there?
Where does the responsibility lie? Well, when a manufacturer is put on notice that there are injuries to people, significant injuries, fatalities, or if the product is malfunctioning in some way, it's not functioning in the way that was intended, that it's unsafe. Once a manufacturer gets notice of this, they should issue a recall.
Mm-hmm.
Oftentimes they don't, though. They turn their heads and they look the other way, and then it's up to consumers to get involved to report these incidents to the federal agencies that regulate certain products, and then hopefully those agencies will issue a recall. But other than that, it's up to the judicial system, and people, unfortunately, incidents happening, and then product liability lawyers getting involved in working up the case, and then putting the case in the system and letting the juries decide what happened. Is there a defective product?
Right.
What are the damages? Were the damages caused by the defective product? So there are a lot of different ways that manufacturers can get notice of the defects, and the manufacturers typically they really prefer not to recall products, and it's an expensive process. It can adversely affect their public image, all these things that are very important to them. So I hope I've answered your question.
Well, and that leads me to my next question: is at what point, as a consumer, as a user of a product, and you think there's been an injury or worse caused by what you think is a defective product for whatever reason, at what point do we contact someone like you and to contact a product liability attorney and get them involved?
Products liability cases are complex, and quite frankly, they're very expensive as well. So there are a lot of products out there that just that break, that just don't work
Sure.
like they're supposed to. And if it's an inexpensive product and it breaks, and take it back to the seller and see if you get your money back or something like this. But once we get into instances where harm is caused to people, significant harm, then it's time to get in touch with a lawyer that works in the area of products liability, or if there's significant property damage. For instance, here's an example. A number of years ago, a lawyer in my office was involved in a case where it involved Christmas tree lights. And the Christmas tree lights were manufactured in China and then shipped to the U.S., sold by a distributor, distributed and then sold by a seller here in the United States. And the thing is, there was a manufacturing defect in the Christmas lights. And what does that mean? There was a perforation or a hole in the wiring next to one of the switches. So when these Christmas lights were wrapped around the tree, someone goes to turn it on, and then there's an electrical arc that catches the tree on fire, and the fire spreads through the house.
Wow.
And luckily, the family was able to evacuate, the mom, the dad, the kids. They got out of the house, but the house burned down with all its contents. So that was just a terribly unfortunate incident. But the thing is, once the damages become significant enough, then it's a case that could warrant talking to a products liability lawyer and pursuing an action in court.
And I would assume you would recommend, your advice would be to talk to somebody sooner rather than later in that situation, because you don't wait until everything's been cleaned up and the repairs have been made and everything like that, I would assume, correct?
Absolutely. If someone has been hurt or there's significant damage because of what one believes to be a defective product, first of all, get a hold of the product and keep the product, preserve the product in the condition that it was after the event. And people don't start tampering with it. It needs to be secured.
Right.
Products liability cases, they're difficult enough as is, but a product's liability without the product makes it even more difficult, because it really is about proving a defect in the product that resulted in harm. So yeah, it's important to speak with a lawyer that works in the products liability arena, because it is a very specialized area, very unique laws that deal with products liability cases. They're very expensive cases to pursue, and ideally we'll have the product that caused the harm, and then we get involved in the investigations, and we preserve the product. We start hiring experts. We begin to identify the different potential parties in the case, who was the manufacturer, maybe who was the designer, the distributors, sellers. So it's a complicated process.
I would assume one that can sometimes take a long time before it comes to some conclusion too, right?
Yes, yeah. Typically, every bit of I'd say 18 months to 3 years,
Wow.
4 years sometimes. And then if there's an appellate process as well. So yeah, they can take significant time and significant resources as well.
Well, thank you, Mike. I appreciate your time today. It's been a lot of really good information. I think it will really help a lot of people today. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
And that's another Ask the Lawyers. I'm Rob Rosenthal with AskTheLawyers.com, where you can go and choose a lawyer that lawyers choose. Until next time, I'm Rob Rosenthal. Have a great day.